Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The fluorescent lights in the campus coffee shop buzzed overhead as I settled into the worn vinyl booth across from Jerome Begay. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee mug, steam rising between us like incense. I had heard whispers about his story for weeks. Fragments of conversation in hallways, nervous glances when his name came up. Now finally he was ready to tell me what happened that October night on the reservation roads near Window Rock. Jerome's dark eyes darted toward the window, then back to me. "You have to understand," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I'm about to tell you changed everything. I can't drive at night anymore without checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. I can't sleep without leaving at least one light on in the house." The incident occurred during his sophomore year at the university. He had driven home for a family gathering, staying later than planned to help his elderly grandmother with some repairs around her house. By the time he and his father started the journey back to his dorm, darkness had swallowed the desert landscape completely. The reservation roads stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by their truck's headlights cutting through the void. "We were maybe 20 miles from Window Rock when Dad first noticed it," Jerome continued, his knuckles white around the ceramic mug. "Something moving parallel to us, just beyond the reach of our headlights. At first we thought it might be a coyote or maybe a stray dog. The desert is full of them." But as they continued driving, the presence became more distinct. Whatever ran alongside their truck maintained perfect pace, not falling behind when they accelerated, not pulling ahead when they slowed for curves. Jerome's father squinted into the darkness, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each passing mile. "That's when we saw the eyes," Jerome whispered, leaning forward. "Two red points of light, like embers floating in the black. They weren't animal eyes. Too high off the ground, too focused, too intelligent." The temperature inside the truck seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jerome's father pressed harder on the accelerator, but their mysterious companion effortlessly kept pace. The red eyes never wavered, never blinked, just bore into them with an intensity that made Jerome's skin crawl. His mouth went dry, and a metallic taste filled his throat, the taste of pure terror. "Then it did something that still haunts me," Jerome said, his voice cracking. "It moved in front of our truck, not gradually, not like an animal crossing the road. It just appeared there, directly in our path. In the glare of their headlights stood a figure wearing tattered clothing, jeans and a flannel shirt that looked like they'd been dragged through thorns and mud for miles. The fabric hung in shreds, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. But it wasn't skin." Jerome struggled to describe what he saw, his words coming in broken fragments. "Its face." He paused, swallowing hard. It wasn't right. The proportions were wrong, like someone had stretched human features too far. And those eyes, they reflected our headlights like an animal's, but with a malevolence that made my stomach lurch. Jerome's father swerved violently to avoid hitting the figure, tires screaming against asphalt as the truck fishtailed. When they regained control and looked back, the road was empty. No sign of whatever had stood there moments before. No footprints, no disturbed gravel, nothing. They drove the remaining distance in complete silence, both afraid to voice what they'd witnessed. Jerome watched his father's reflection in the side mirror, jaw clenched, eyes constantly darting to check behind them. Even now, months later, his father refused to discuss that night, acting as if acknowledging it might somehow summon it back. "I still have nightmares," Jerome admitted as our conversation wound down. "I see those red eyes watching me from dark corners of my dorm room. Sometimes I wake up convinced something is scratching at my window, even though I'm on the 3rd floor. As I left the coffee shop that night, Jerome's haunted expression lingered in my mind. This wasn't the rambling of someone seeking attention or trying to scare me with reservation folklore. This was the testimony of someone whose worldview had been shattered by an encounter with something that shouldn't exist, yet clearly did. 2 weeks after my conversation with Jerome, I heard about Diana Benally through a mutual friend. She was reluctant to share her story at first, insisting that most people wouldn't believe her. But when I mentioned Jerome's account, her resistance crumbled. She agreed to meet me at a quiet diner off Highway 491, away from curious ears and judgmental stares. Diana arrived wearing a heavy jacket despite the warm afternoon, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if warding off an invisible chill. Dark circles under her eyes suggested weeks of poor sleep. She ordered black coffee and stared into the cup for several minutes before speaking. "It started with something as innocent as a garage sale," she began, her voice hollow. "My family holds one every summer in Church Rock, just to clear out clothes and household items we no longer need. Neighbors stop by, chat about their kids, maybe find a bargain or two. It's always been a pleasant community event. But last summer's sale took a disturbing turn when a stranger appeared around midday. Diana described him as unnaturally tall and gaunt, with skin that seemed stretched too tightly over sharp bones. His clothes looked expensive but old-fashioned, as if he'd stepped out of a photograph from decades past. Most unsettling were his eyes, pale blue, almost colorless, and they never seemed to blink. He went straight to my father's clothing section," Diana continued, absently rubbing her arms. "Dad had put out shirts, jackets, and jeans that no longer fit him. Normal stuff. But this man examined each piece like he was appraising precious artifacts. He held them up to the light, ran his fingers over the fabric, even pressed them to his nose to smell them. The stranger's behavior made Diana's skin crawl, but her father insisted they treat him like any other customer. The man methodically selected every single item from the clothing table, garments that were clearly too small for his skeletal frame. He paid with bills that felt oddly cold to the touch and smelled of damp earth. Before he left, he looked directly at me," Diana said, her voice dropping to barely audible. His lips curved into what might have been a smile, but it was wrong. Too wide, too knowing, like he was sharing a secret joke that only he understood. 3 days later, Diana's father began experiencing violent nightmares. He would wake screaming, clawing at his sheets, mumbling about being buried alive or drowning in thick black liquid. During the day, he complained of constant nausea and a crawling sensation under his skin, as if insects were burrowing through his flesh. Then the sores appeared, Diana whispered, unconsciously scratching her own arms. They started small, like mosquito bites, but they spread and deepened. Dad would scratch until he bled, but they only got worse. He lost weight rapidly, refusing to eat because everything tasted like rotting meat. Diana's mother wanted to take him to the hospital, but her father insisted that doctors couldn't help with what he was experiencing. He claimed the nightmares weren't random. They featured the same pale-eyed stranger who would visit him in his dreams and whisper promises of pain and suffering. He told me the man in his dreams wasn't just wearing clothes, Diana continued, her hands shaking as she lifted her coffee cup. He was wearing Dad's clothes, the ones we sold him, and every night the stranger would describe in horrible detail what he was doing while wearing them. Desperate for help, Diana's family contacted a traditional medicine man named Ben Yazzie, an elderly healer who had dealt with similar situations throughout his long career. Ben arrived at their home just as the sun began setting, carrying a worn leather bag filled with ceremonial items and herbs. Ben took one look at my father and knew immediately what we were dealing with, Diana recalled. He said someone had used Dad's personal belongings to create a connection, a spiritual pathway that allowed them to inflict harm from a distance. Ben instructed the family to help him search the property for any buried objects or hidden bundles. They spent over an hour combing through brush and checking around the foundation of the house. finding nothing. Just as Diana began to lose hope, Ben paused near a cluster of yucca plants about 50 yards from their front door. He knelt down and started digging with his bare hands. Diana said, her voice tight with remembered tension. The soil was hard-packed, but he clawed through it like he knew exactly what lay beneath. When he pulled up that bundle, the smell hit us immediately. Death and decay so powerful it made me gag. Wrapped in her father's old flannel shirt were several disturbing items: a photograph of her father with his eyes scratched out, fingernail clippings mixed with grave dirt, and a piece of rotting meat crawling with maggots. Most horrifying was a small doll, fashioned from hair and fabric, with pins driven through its chest and abdomen. Ben's face went pale when he saw the doll, Diana continued. He said whoever created this bundle possessed knowledge of the darkest traditional practices, techniques that had been forbidden for generations because of their destructive power. The medicine man immediately began a cleansing ceremony, burning sage and cedar while chanting in the old language. Diana watched smoke swirl around the cursed bundle, and she swore she could see shapes moving within the gray clouds, twisted faces screaming silently before dissolving into nothingness. As Ben worked, I felt something shift in the air around us, Diana said. The oppressive weight that had settled over our home for weeks began to lift. Dad stopped thrashing in his sleep, and for the first time in days, his breathing became steady and peaceful. Ben carefully wrapped the cursed items in white cloth, then buried them in a location he refused to reveal. Before leaving, he warned the family to be extremely cautious about selling personal belongings, especially clothing that had absorbed the wearer's essence over time. He told us that some people practice the old ways for evil purposes, Diana explained. They collect hair, nail clippings, and clothing to create spiritual links with their victims. Once that connection is established, they can inflict illness, madness, or even death from great distances. In the days following Ben's intervention, Diana's father began a gradual recovery. The sores on his skin started healing, his appetite returned, and the crushing nightmares faded to uncomfortable but manageable dreams. However, the psychological impact lingered like a persistent shadow. Dad became paranoid about strangers, Diana told me, absently shredding her paper napkin. He would interrogate anyone who came to our door, even people we'd known for years. He installed multiple locks on every entrance and started sleeping with a hunting knife under his pillow. The family also noticed other disturbing changes in their father's behavior. He began avoiding mirrors, claiming he sometimes saw the pale-eyed stranger standing behind his reflection. Certain smells, particularly earth and decay, would send him into panic attacks. He couldn't tolerate being alone after dark and insisted that family members remain within sight at all times. Mom thought the trauma had damaged his mind permanently, Diana said. But I think he was still feeling the effects of whatever that thing did to him. Like part of him remained connected to something horrible. 3 months after the incident, Diana's father finally opened up about the full extent of his nightmares. The pale-eyed stranger hadn't just worn his clothing in the dreams. He had somehow absorbed aspects of her father's personality and memories. In the twisted dream landscape, the stranger would replay private moments from her father's life, corrupting cherished memories and turning them into sources of shame and self-loathing. The worst part, Diana whispered, was that Dad said the stranger knew things he'd never told anyone. Childhood embarrassments, private fears, mistakes he'd made decades ago. It was like having his soul violated and exposed. Ben Yazzie visited periodically to check on the family's progress and perform additional protective ceremonies. During one visit, he revealed more disturbing details about the type of curse they had encountered. Ben told us that the stranger probably wasn't working alone, Diana said. These kinds of elaborate curses require multiple practitioners and considerable resources. Someone had paid handsomely to have Dad targeted, which meant he had enemies he didn't even know about. This revelation sparked weeks of paranoid speculation within the family. Who could harbor such intense hatred toward Diana's father, a quiet man who worked as a school janitor and minded his own business? They examined every interaction, every casual disagreement, searching for clues about their invisible enemy. We never found answers, Diana admitted, but the uncertainty was almost worse than the original curse. At least when Dad was sick, we knew what we were fighting. Living with the knowledge that someone wanted to destroy us and might try again created a different kind of hell. As autumn deepened and I continued collecting accounts from reservation residents, a pattern began emerging. Multiple witnesses described encounters with unnaturally tall, pale figures who seemed to possess intimate knowledge of their personal lives. These beings appeared during vulnerable moments, late-night drives, solitary walks, quiet evenings at home, and their presence invariably brought profound psychological disturbance. My third major interview came through Jerome Begay, who connected me with his cousin Vincent Nez. Vincent worked as a maintenance supervisor for the Tribal Housing Authority and spent considerable time driving between remote communities after dark. His encounter occurred during a routine inspection trip to a cluster of homes near Lukachukai. I was heading back from checking on some elderly residents, Vincent told me during our meeting at a truck stop outside Shiprock. It was close to midnight, and the road was empty except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when I first saw it standing beside the highway. Vincent described a figure at least 7 feet tall, wearing what appeared to be a formal suit that looked decades out of style. Even from a distance, he could see the creature's unnaturally pale skin and those same colorless eyes that Diana had described. Most disturbing was its absolute stillness. It stood motionless beside the road like a signpost watching his approaching vehicle. I slowed down as I got closer. Vincent continued, nervously drumming his fingers on the table. Part of me was curious, part terrified. When my headlights hit it full on, I could see details that still make me sick to remember. The creature's face was gaunt to the point of appearing skeletal, with pronounced cheekbones and deeply sunken eyes. Its skin had an waxy, translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath the surface. Most horrifying was its smile, a too-wide grimace that exposed rows of teeth that seemed both human and predatory. As I drove past, it turned its head to follow my truck, Vincent said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The movement was too smooth, too controlled, like its neck could rotate much further than any humans should. Vincent pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to put distance between himself and the roadside figure. But when he checked his rearview mirror, the creature was somehow keeping pace with his truck, gliding across the desert terrain without any visible effort. No running motion, no apparent exertion, just smooth, impossible pursuit. I floored it, pushing my truck to speeds that were dangerous on those winding roads, Vincent recalled. But that thing stayed with me for over 10 miles, always maintaining the same distance, never falling behind. The pursuit ended as abruptly as it began. Vincent crested a hill and the creature simply vanished, leaving him alone with racing pulse and sweat-soaked clothes. He drove straight home without stopping, triple-locked his doors, and spent the rest of the night sitting in his living room with all the lights on. For weeks afterward, I would see it in my peripheral vision, Vincent admitted. Standing at the edge of parking lots, lurking behind buildings, always just far enough away that I couldn't be certain it was really there. But I knew it was watching me, studying me, waiting for the right moment to approach. Vincent's encounters escalated dramatically 3 weeks after his initial roadside sighting. He was working late in his home office, catching up on inspection reports, when he heard a soft tapping at his front window. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, 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 like someone politely requesting entry. I figured it was probably a neighbor with an emergency, Vincent told me, though his expression suggested he had suspected otherwise. But when I pulled back the curtain, that thing was standing right outside my window, close enough that its breath was fogging the glass. The creature's pale face filled the entire window frame, those colorless eyes staring directly into Vincent's with an intensity that made his knees buckle. Up close, he could see additional horrifying details. Skin that looked artificially stretched, lips that were too thin and bloodless, and teeth that appeared sharp enough to tear flesh. It didn't move or make any sound, Vincent continued, unconsciously rubbing his arms as if trying to warm himself. It just stood there watching me, and I swear it was reading my thoughts. I could feel its presence inside my head, poking around my memories like someone rifling through personal belongings. Vincent stumbled backward, knocking over his desk chair and sending papers scattering across the floor. The creature pressed its face closer to the glass, leaving a greasy smear that spelled out letters in what looked like an ancient script. The writing pulsed with a faint, sickly light before fading away. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the screen kept flickering and going black, Vincent said. Every electronic device in my house started malfunctioning, lights dimming and brightening, the television switching channels by itself, my computer making sounds like it was screaming. The supernatural interference lasted for nearly an hour, during which the creature remained motionless at Vincent's window. He huddled in his bedroom closet, clutching a baseball bat and praying to God for protection. When the electronic chaos finally stopped and silence returned, he cautiously emerged to find his front yard empty. But it left evidence, Vincent whispered, leaning closer to me across the table. The next morning, I found handprints on my window, if you could call them handprints. The fingers were too long, and there were too many of them. 7 digits on each hand, all ending in what looked like claws. Vincent showed me photographs he had taken of the mysterious prints. The images were blurry and difficult to interpret, but I could make out elongated finger shapes pressed against the glass. More disturbing were the scratches around the window frame. Deep gouges in the wood that suggested incredible strength. I called Ben Yazzie immediately, Vincent continued. He came over that same day and performed a blessing ceremony around my entire property. He also gave me a protection bundle to carry and warned me to avoid being alone after dark. Despite Ben's intervention, Vincent continued experiencing supernatural harassment for months. He would find strange symbols drawn in the dirt around his house, hear whispers in languages he didn't recognize, and wake up to discover his belongings had been rearranged while he slept. As I compiled these accounts and others like them, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The encounters weren't random or isolated. They seemed to be part of a coordinated campaign targeting specific individuals across the reservation. Each victim had been carefully selected and studied before being approached by these pale, otherworldly figures. I decided to bring Jerome, Diana, and Vincent together for a group discussion, hoping that comparing their experiences might reveal additional patterns or connections. We met at a community center in Window Rock on a gray October afternoon, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. I've been thinking about why we were chosen, Diana said as we settled into a circle of folding chairs. Jerome's family is known for preserving traditional stories and ceremonies. My father worked at the school and influenced young people. Vincent maintains housing for our most vulnerable community members. We all held positions of trust and responsibility. Jerome nodded grimly. It's like something was trying to undermine the foundation of our community by targeting people who serve others. If they could break us down mentally and spiritually, they could create fear and suspicion that would spread to everyone around us. Vincent had brought along additional photographs and documents related to his ongoing harassment. The evidence was disturbing. More strange handprints, symbols carved into trees near his house, and even what appeared to be surveillance photos of him taken from impossible angles. Look at this, Vincent said, spreading the images across a table. These pictures were taken from at least 50 feet up in the air, but there are no buildings or towers in that area. Whatever took these photos was floating or flying. As we examined Vincent's evidence, I noticed that several symbols appeared in multiple locations, carved into wood, drawn in dirt, even scratched into the paint of his truck. When I pointed this out, Diana gasped and pulled out her phone. "I've been seeing those same symbols," she said, scrolling through her photos. "Around our house, at my workplace, even on the bathroom mirror at the grocery store. I thought it was just random vandalism, but now..." The symbols were clearly not random graffiti. They formed a consistent pattern that appeared to be building toward something, a message or summoning that was being constructed piece by piece across the reservation. The implications were terrifying. "Ben Yazzie needs to see this," Jerome said, his face pale with worry. "If these things are working together on some kind of larger plan, our individual protection ceremonies might not be enough." As if summoned by our discussion, thunder rumbled overhead, and rain began pelting the community center's metal roof. The storm seemed to arrive from nowhere, transforming the gray afternoon into premature darkness. Outside the windows, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, frightening detail. "They're stronger during storms," Vincent whispered, instinctively moving his chair away from the windows. "I've noticed that my encounters always happen when the weather is bad. Heavy rain, snow, high winds, like they feed off the atmospheric chaos." As we huddled together in the community center, listening to the storm rage outside, I realized that my investigation had uncovered something far more dangerous than individual supernatural encounters. We were dealing with an organized threat that was methodically working to terrorize and destabilize the entire reservation community. The storm lasted through the night, and by morning, reports of new encounters began filtering in from across the reservation. Ben Yazzie received multiple calls from families experiencing supernatural harassment, all describing the same pale figures and mysterious symbols that we had been tracking. I arranged to meet with Ben at his home near Crystal, hoping his years of experience with traditional healing could provide insight into what we were facing. The elderly medicine man greeted me with obvious concern, his weathered face grave with worry. "These things you've been investigating," Ben said as we sat in his living room surrounded by ceremonial items and protective bundles, "they're not what most people think they are. They're not ghosts or demons from our traditional stories. They're something else entirely, something that doesn't belong in this world." Ben explained that similar encounters had been reported decades earlier, always during periods of social upheaval or community stress. The pale figures seemed to appear when the reservation faced external threats or internal divisions, as if they were drawn to conflict and despair. "My grandfather told me about sightings during the stock reduction period in the 1930s, Ben continued. "Families were forced to slaughter their livestock, children were taken to boarding schools, and our people felt hopeless and abandoned. That's when these creatures first appeared in significant numbers." According to Ben, the entities weren't content to simply frighten their victims. They seemed to feed off psychological trauma, deliberately targeting individuals who served as pillars of community strength. By breaking down respected leaders, healers, and caretakers, they could create ripple effects that damaged entire extended families and social networks. "The symbols you've been finding," Ben said, producing a leather journal filled with hand-drawn sketches, "they're not from any Native American tradition I know. They look more like European occultism, or perhaps something even older. Someone or something is using knowledge from outside our culture to attack us." Ben's journal contained detailed documentation of previous encounters spanning several decades. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Tall, pale figures with inhuman features who possessed intimate knowledge of their victims' personal lives and psychological vulnerabilities. "What worries me most," Ben admitted, "is that the encounters are becoming more frequent and more aggressive. In the past, these things would appear, terrorize someone for a few weeks, then disappear. But now they seem to be establishing a permanent presence." As if to emphasize his point, Ben's phone rang with another report. A family in Chinle had awakened to find their front door standing open and muddy footprints throughout their house, prints that matched the elongated, clawed impressions Vincent had photographed. "We need to organize a community-wide protection ceremony," Ben said after hanging up. "Individual healings aren't enough anymore. If these entities are working together, we need to respond collectively. I left Ben's house that afternoon with a deeper understanding of the threat we faced, but also with a growing sense of urgency. The pale figures weren't just random supernatural predators. They represented an organized invasion that threatened the spiritual and psychological foundation of the entire reservation community. As I drove home through the desert landscape, I found myself checking my rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see those familiar red eyes keeping pace with my vehicle. The investigation that had begun with simple curiosity about local folklore had evolved into something far more serious, a documentation of an ongoing spiritual war for the soul of the Navajo Nation. That night, I began writing down everything I had learned, determined to preserve these accounts before my own encounter inevitably arrived. Because after months of investigating these phenomena, I had come to realize an uncomfortable truth. No one who dug too deeply into this mystery remained untouched by it forever. The Pale Watchers had taken notice of my activities, and somewhere in the vast darkness of the reservation, they were preparing to pay me a visit of their own. I could only hope that when that moment came, I would possess the courage and spiritual protection necessary to survive what Jerome, Diana, Vincent, and countless others had endured. The desert night pressed against my windows as I wrote, and every shifting shadow made me wonder if pale eyes were already watching, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the darkness and into my life. When I was young, my parents would abandon me at my grandparents' house in Millfield almost every other weekend during the late 1990s. They lived in this decrepit two-story Victorian with rotting wood siding and too many rooms that seemed to breathe with malevolent life. The place always reeked of mothballs and decay, mixed with whatever my grandmother was attempting to salvage from her ancient cookbooks. It wasn't the worst arrangement. I received stale cookies and dangerous amounts of neglect, except for one horrifying reality: Bruno. Bruno was my grandfather's obsession, a massive German shepherd that he'd acquired before my birth. By the time I was forming coherent memories around age 4, Bruno was already a seasoned predator disguised as a family pet. My grandfather, Edmund, had molded him through brutal training regimens for regional intimidation competitions when Bruno was younger. The basement wall displayed his grotesque trophies: ribbons and photographs of Bruno looking menacing beside my grandfather's twisted grin. To every visiting neighbor and family friend, Bruno represented the pinnacle of canine discipline and intelligence. To me, he embodied pure terror, given flesh and fur. The house itself seemed to conspire with Bruno's malevolence. Shadows lingered too long in corners where they had no business existing. Floorboards groaned under invisible weight during the darkest hours. Windows rattled without wind, and doors creaked open on their own, as if the structure itself was breathing. Shallow, labored breaths that matched the rhythm of Bruno's constant panting. My grandmother, Constance, treated Bruno like the son she never had, feeding him raw meat by hand while crooning disturbing lullabies in a voice that made my skin crawl. She would ask Bruno if he wanted another piece of bleeding steak in that sickening baby voice, answering herself that yes, of course he did. He was such a good boy, such a perfect boy. Meanwhile, I spent every waking moment calculating escape routes and safe hiding spots throughout that cursed house. The adults never witnessed Bruno's true nature. Their blindness to his malevolence was absolute and terrifying. How could they not see what was happening right in front of them? How could they miss the calculated intelligence burning behind those yellow eyes, the way his lips would curl into something resembling a human smirk when he thought no one was watching? The first time I understood that something fundamentally wrong existed within Bruno's skull, I was barely 5 years old. I was sprawled across the kitchen linoleum with my coloring books while my grandmother prepared what she generously called lunch. Bruno lay beneath the scratched wooden table, supposedly sleeping off his morning meal of God knows what. I accidentally dropped my red crayon, the one I was using to color a fire truck, and when I reached down to retrieve it, Bruno's eyes snapped open with mechanical precision. Those weren't the warm, dopey eyes of a normal dog. They were completely focused, calculating, almost human in their malicious intelligence. He didn't growl or bare his yellowed teeth. That would have been easier to explain to the adults who insisted on treating him like a beloved family member. Instead, he simply stared at me with those cold, predatory eyes, and I swear to God he smiled. Not the happy, tongue-lolling grin that people mistake for canine joy, but something knowing and cruel and hungry. His black lips pulled back just enough to reveal the tips of his canine teeth, and his eyes narrowed with what I can only describe as amusement. It was the look of something that understood exactly how vulnerable I was, how completely at his mercy I remained. I yanked my hand back so violently that I struck my knuckles against the table leg hard enough to draw blood. The sharp pain barely registered through my terror. When I tried to explain what happened to my grandmother, she laughed it off with that dismissive chuckle adults use when children report things that don't fit their comfortable worldview. She insisted that Bruno adored children and was probably just playing with me, being friendly. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next decade of my life. Whenever adults were present, Bruno performed his role as the perfect family pet with Academy Award-worthy precision. The moment they turned away, even for seconds, he transformed into something else entirely. Something that watched and waited and planned with frightening intelligence. My grandfather constantly bragged about Bruno to anyone who would listen, claiming he was the smartest dog he'd ever encountered. He would often remark, with obvious pride, that sometimes he believed Bruno understood every word of human conversation. My grandmother was equally deluded, hand-feeding him chunks of raw meat while speaking to him in that nauseating baby voice that made my stomach turn. I learned quickly that the adults would never believe me about Bruno's behavior. After all, he was such a good dog, so well-trained, so intelligent. When I was 7, I was playing alone in the backyard while my grandparents tended their withering garden. I had this plastic action figure, a superhero whose name escapes me now, that I'd received for my birthday. I set the toy down for maybe 30 seconds to retie my sneaker. When I looked up, Bruno was standing directly over my action figure, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the bright plastic colors. He stared directly into my eyes with that same calculating expression I'd learned to fear, then slowly, deliberately picked up the toy in his massive jaws. The sound of plastic cracking between his teeth was obscenely loud in the afternoon silence. He applied pressure gradually, methodically, like someone carefully breaking each bone in a small animal. The action figure's arms snapped first, then the legs, then the torso crumpled with a sickening crunch. Throughout this destruction, Bruno never broke eye contact with me. His tail wagged in slow, deliberate sweeps, like a metronome keeping time with my increasing terror. When he finished destroying my toy, he dropped the mangled remains at my feet with ceremonial precision, then walked away with his tail high and his step jaunty, as if he'd accomplished something worth celebrating. The mutilated plastic looked like the remains of something that had been alive, something that had suffered. When I ran crying to my grandmother, she scolded me for leaving my toys where poor Bruno could mistake them for his own playthings. My grandfather handed me 5 crumpled dollar bills and told me to be more careful next time, to think about how confusing it must be for a dog to see unfamiliar objects in his territory. Their complete inability to see what was happening felt like a form of madness. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining things that weren't there? But the destroyed toy in my hands was real enough, and the memory of Bruno's calculating smile burned behind my eyelids every time I tried to sleep. The worst incident occurred when I was 9 years old, during a particularly dark October weekend. I was sleeping in the guest room at the end of the upstairs hallway, a room that always smelled like dust and old death, where the wallpaper peeled in long strips that resembled diseased skin. I woke around midnight with my bladder demanding attention. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel into hell, dark and seemingly endless. I didn't want to wake anyone by turning on lights, so I crept toward the bathroom, using the faint moonlight filtering through grimy windows. Halfway down the hall, I heard the familiar click of nails on hardwood. Bruno materialized at the far end of the corridor, just a hulking silhouette against the lesser darkness. He stood perfectly motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Something about his posture was wrong, unnatural. He wasn't standing like a normal dog. He was too still, too purposeful, like a predator that had caught the scent of wounded prey. I took one step backward toward my room, and he took one step forward. I stepped back again, and he mirrored my movement exactly. It was like some twisted dance, some perverse game where the rules were written in my terror and his amusement. His breathing was audible now. Deep, controlled inhalations and exhalations that sounded almost human. When I finally turned to run back to my room, I heard him coming after me. Not the clumsy gallop of an excited dog, but measured, calculated steps that seemed to match my own panicked rhythm. I barely made it through my door before slamming it shut and turning the lock with shaking fingers. Bruno hit the door with tremendous force, making the entire frame shudder. Then came silence. The kind of complete quiet that feels more threatening than any sound. I stood there trembling, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Then I heard it, scratching at the door. Not the frantic clawing of a dog that wanted inside, but deliberate, methodical gouging. The sound was rhythmic, almost artistic, as if he was carving something meaningful into the wood. It continued for nearly 2 hours before stopping. In the morning, there were deep gouges in the bottom of the door. Not random scratches, but deliberate marks that almost looked like letters or symbols. My grandfather examined the damage with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger at his precious dog, but something closer to fear. For the first time, I saw doubt in an adult's eyes when they looked at Bruno. My grandfather stared at those scratches for a long time, then at Bruno, then back at the scratches. He mumbled something about this not being like Bruno at all, about never seeing behavior like this before. But there was something in his voice, something that suggested maybe he had seen things he couldn't explain. When I was 11, Bruno died, and I wish I could claim to feel anything other than overwhelming relief. I was staying with my grandparents that particular weekend when it happened, and Bruno had been acting stranger than usual all day. More aggressive, more unpredictable. He'd spent hours pacing through the house, his nails clicking incessantly on the hardwood floors like some demented percussion instrument. He would stop randomly in doorways, staring at empty spaces as if he could see things the rest of us couldn't. His growling was constant and low, directed at shadows and corners where nothing visible lurked. That night, his behavior escalated to the point where my grandfather had to physically drag him to the basement and lock him in. Even through the thick wooden door and down a full flight of stairs, we could hear Bruno's barking. Not normal dog barking, but something that sounded almost like screaming. The sounds were rhythmic and deliberate, as if he was trying to communicate something urgent and terrible. Around 3 a.m, I woke to complete silence. The kind of absolute quiet that feels wrong when you're accustomed to the normal creaks and sighs of an old house. I lay there in the darkness, suddenly aware that I couldn't hear Bruno anymore. No barking, no pacing, no scratching, nothing. The silence was somehow more terrifying than his noise had been. It felt heavy and expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I pulled my blankets over my head and tried to convince myself that Bruno had simply tired himself out and fallen asleep. In the morning, my grandfather found him at the bottom of the basement stairs, dead. The veterinarian later determined it was a massive heart attack, apparently common for his age and breed. Natural causes, nothing suspicious. Case closed. But what the veterinarian didn't see What my grandmother quickly ushered me away from before I could examine too closely was Bruno's expression. His lips were pulled back in what looked like a snarl of pure rage, his eyes wide open and staring at something only he could see. His front paws were extended as if he'd been reaching for something at the moment of death. He didn't look peaceful. He didn't look like he'd simply succumbed to age and genetics. He looked furious, cheated, as if death had interrupted something important he'd been planning to accomplish. I thought that would be the end of Bruno's reign of terror. I was catastrophically wrong. 3 months after Bruno's death, I arrived for another weekend visit to discover something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, positioned near my grandfather's favorite leather armchair in the den, was Bruno, stuffed and mounted in a standing position that captured him at his most intimidating. The taxidermist had done exceptional work. Bruno's fur had been expertly groomed and positioned, his posture regal and alert, exactly like in those competition photographs that still lined the basement walls. His mouth was slightly open, revealing those yellowed canine teeth that had haunted my nightmares for years. But something was wrong with his eyes. They were glass, obviously artificial, but they seemed to track movement around the room. No matter where I stood, those dead eyes followed me with the same calculating intelligence I remembered from life. The taxidermist had somehow captured the essence of Bruno's malevolent personality and trapped it behind those glassy windows. My grandfather beamed with pride as he asked if I thought Bruno looked magnificent. He explained that now Bruno would always be with them, watching over the family, protecting the house. My grandmother seemed less enthusiastic about the arrangement, but she supported her husband's decision with the kind of resigned acceptance that comes after decades of marriage. She explained quietly that my grandfather couldn't bear to part with Bruno, that this was his way of processing grief. But there was something in her voice, something that suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with having a dead dog standing guard in their living room. That night was the first time I experienced what would become a terrifying pattern. I was reading in bed when I heard it, the familiar click of nails on hardwood in the hallway outside my room. The same measured rhythm, the same deliberate pace that had terrorized me for years. My door, which I was certain I'd closed and locked, stood slightly ajar. Through that gap I could see nothing but darkness, but I felt something watching me with predatory patience. I sat paralyzed, staring at that opening, certain I would see Bruno's face appear in the shadows. Nothing materialized, but the feeling of being observed was overwhelming. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, the hallway was empty. I looked down the stairs toward the den, where I could see Bruno's taxidermied form in the dim light, exactly where it had been earlier, unchanging, motionless, dead. I barricaded my door with a chair and barely slept that night. In the morning, I found small, dusty paw prints on the hardwood outside my room. Prints that looked exactly like Bruno's, but that was impossible. When I showed my grandmother, she frowned and muttered something about the neighbor's cat somehow getting inside. But we both knew the neighbors didn't have pets. Over the next 2 years, my weekend visits became exercises in psychological torture. Objects would move around the house, usually my belongings, displaced or hidden in locations where I'd never left them. I'd find my backpack unzipped, homework scattered across floors like confetti. My clothes would be pulled from drawers and arranged in strange patterns that almost looked deliberate. Once I discovered my sneaker in the backyard garden, chewed beyond recognition and covered in fresh saliva that couldn't be explained. The shoe looked like it had been savaged by something with powerful jaws and a taste for destruction. The taxidermied Bruno never seemed to move. At least I never caught him in the act. But sometimes I'd enter the den and find him facing a different direction than I remembered. When I'd mention this to my grandparents, they'd insist nothing had changed, that my memory was playing tricks on me. The incidents escalated gradually, systematically, like a carefully planned campaign of terror. I'd wake up to find my blankets pulled off during the night, scattered on the floor as if something had been searching underneath them. I'd feel pressure at the foot of my bed, like a large animal settling down to sleep. but nothing was ever there when I turned on the lights. The clicking of nails became a regular nighttime occurrence, always stopping just outside my door. Sometimes I could hear breathing, deep, controlled inhalations and exhalations that sounded too measured to be natural. On particularly bad nights, I could hear what sounded like scratching inside the walls, as if something was trying to claw its way out from within the house's structure. My parents thought I was having behavioral problems. My grandparents were concerned but helpless. They never experienced anything themselves, which made my reports sound like the fantasies of an unstable child. My grandfather would suggest that maybe the old house was just settling, but I could tell he was troubled by something he couldn't articulate. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the taxidermied Bruno with an expression of uncertainty, as if he was beginning to question the wisdom of preserving his beloved pet. There were moments when he seemed to be listening to sounds only he could hear, his head tilted and his eyes distant. The final incident happened when I was 14, during what I promised myself would be my last overnight stay at that cursed house. It was spring break of 2003, and my grandparents had gone to bed early, leaving me alone with the television and my growing dread. I must have dozed off on the living room couch because I woke suddenly around midnight to find the television still broadcasting some late-night talk show. I had that unmistakable feeling of being watched, that primitive awareness that predators instill in their prey. The taxidermied Bruno was gone from his usual position near my grandfather's chair. The empty space where he'd stood seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I sat up fully, my heart racing as I scanned the dark room. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe my grandfather had moved him for cleaning, or perhaps the mounting had finally given way. But deep in my bones, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was happening, something that defied every logical explanation I could construct. I decided to retreat to my room upstairs, moving as quietly as possible through the house that seemed to breathe around me. Each step on the old staircase seemed to echo louder than it should have, as if the house itself was announcing my presence to whatever lurked in the shadows. When I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it, the clicking of nails on hardwood coming from my room. Not the remembered echo of past terror, but immediate, present, real. I should have run to my grandparents' room, should have screamed for help. But fear paralyzed my legs and stole my voice. I approached my bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar, and pushed it open with a trembling hand. There, in the center of my room, was Bruno. Not the stiff, artificial construct of the taxidermist, but something else entirely. Something that defied every natural law I'd been taught to trust. He looked solid but somehow wrong, like a photograph that had been poorly developed. His fur was dull and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His movements were jerky and unnatural, but his eyes, those yellow, calculating eyes, were exactly as I remembered them from life, burning with malicious intelligence and patient hunger. When he saw me, his mouth opened in what could only be described as a smile, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally white in the darkness. The expression was so human, so deliberately cruel, that my mind recoiled from processing what I was seeing. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch in paralyzed terror as he slowly approached me, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor with each deliberate step. When he was directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the musty odor of death and preservation chemicals, he stopped. For a moment that lasted an eternity, nothing happened. We stared at each other across the impossible gap between life and death, between sanity and madness. Then, faster than thought, he lunged forward and seized a mouthful of my hair in his jaws. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but it also broke the spell of terror that had held me motionless. I screamed as Bruno began dragging me by my hair toward the hallway, his supernatural strength easily overcoming my desperate struggles. I clawed at the doorframe, trying to grab onto something, anything that might anchor me to safety. My screams finally penetrated the thick walls and woke my grandparents. I heard their bedroom door slam open and their frantic footsteps in the hallway. My grandfather's voice called out, asking what was happening, then stopped mid-sentence as he rounded the corner and saw what was occurring. The moment the hallway light blazed on, Bruno vanished. Not ran away, not released me and fled, simply ceased to exist, as if he'd been nothing more than a shadow that couldn't survive illumination. 1 second he was there, solid and real and terrifying, gripping my hair with supernatural strength. The next second I was alone, collapsed on the floor and sobbing uncontrollably. My grandmother helped me to my feet while my grandfather stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the empty space where Bruno had been. His face was completely drained of color, his eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from having your fundamental understanding of reality shattered. I asked him through my tears if he had seen it too, if I wasn't going insane. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper, as he admitted that he had seen something. Something that shouldn't have been possible. That night, while I lay trembling in my grandparents' bed, there was no way I was sleeping alone. I heard my grandfather go downstairs. There was silence for a long time. Then the sound of the back door opening and closing. Heavy footsteps crossed the backyard, followed by the distinctive sound of a shovel biting into earth. In the morning, the taxidermied Bruno was gone. My grandfather refused to tell me exactly what he'd done with it, only saying that it had been taken care of, that some things shouldn't be preserved, that some doors, once opened, are difficult to close. He finally admitted that he'd been experiencing things too. Objects moved, strange noises, a persistent feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. He'd dismissed it all, convinced it was just grief and imagination playing tricks on his aging mind. I never stayed overnight at my grandparents' house again. My parents didn't understand my refusal, but they respected it after seeing the genuine terror in my eyes whenever the subject was mentioned. Years later, after both my grandparents had passed away and we were cleaning out their house, I found a small metal box buried in the backyard garden under an unmarked stone. Inside was a dog collar, worn and faded, with the name Bruno barely visible on the tarnished tag. Next to it was a note in my grandfather's shaking handwriting. Some doors, once opened, are hard to close. Some love becomes something else in the dark. May God forgive me for what I tried to keep. I reburied the box exactly where I found it, and never told anyone about the discovery. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. I still sometimes wake in the night to the phantom sound of nails clicking on hardwood, and I know that somewhere, in the space between life and death, Bruno is still hunting. But as long as his remains stay buried and forgotten, as long as no one else tries to preserve what should be allowed to die, I think the door will remain closed. The house in Millfield was eventually demolished. The new owners complained of strange sounds and unexplained phenomena, but they attributed it to the age of the structure. When the bulldozers finally came, I felt something that might have been relief. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if destroying the house was enough. I wonder if some forms of love, twisted by grief and denial, can survive even the destruction of their earthly anchors. I wonder, and I try not to listen too carefully to the sounds outside my bedroom door. I was 17 at the time, restless with the particular brand of boredom that afflicts teenagers in the digital age. My grandparents owned a sprawling ranch nestled among the pine-covered slopes of the Rim Mountains in Arizona. The property featured their main house, a sturdy 2-story log structure, and 7 smaller rental cabins scattered throughout the property, each positioned to offer privacy and stunning views of the wilderness. During spring and summer, my family would visit regularly, enjoying hikes through wildflower-filled meadows and cool evenings under star-filled skies. But winter visits were rare. The mountain roads became treacherous. Heavy snow isolated the ranch, and temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Yet that February, my parents decided we needed a family getaway. "It'll be good to disconnect," my father said, eyes fixed on the road as our SUV climbed higher into the mountains. No internet, minimal cell service, just family time. My brother Andrew, 10 years my senior, sat in the back seat with his wife Joanna and their children, 4-year-old Emma and 2-year-old Ben. My cousin Nell was squeezed between the child seats, her attention fixed on a dog-eared paperback. "Weather report says we might get another 8 inches tonight," Mom commented, studying her phone before the signal disappeared entirely. The SUV's wipers fought against the thickening snowfall as we made the final turn onto the unmarked gravel road leading to the ranch. The snow muffled everything, creating that particular winter silence that feels both peaceful and somehow watchful. Our tires crunched over the fresh powder as we pulled up to the main house. Grandpa Russell stood on the porch, his tall frame wrapped in a heavy wool coat, breath visible in the cold air. His weathered face broke into a warm smile as we tumbled out of the vehicle, stiff from the 3-hour drive. "Perfect timing," he called out, helping us with our bags. "Your grandmother just pulled a venison stew off the stove." Inside, the house was warm and fragrant with cooking smells. Grandma June welcomed us with firm hugs, her silver hair pulled back in her usual neat bun. The familiar surroundings, antler chandeliers, well-worn leather furniture, and walls lined with family photos, created an immediate sense of comfort. After dinner, as the adults talked around the fireplace, I watched the snow intensify outside the large picture window. The flakes grew larger, illuminated by the porch lights, swirling in hypnotic patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Something about their movement made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. "You and Nell will be staying in Pine Cabin," Grandma informed me, breaking my trance. "We've got the heater running already." Pine Cabin was the closest of the rental cabins to the main house, though still a good 100 yards through the woods. I nodded, unaware that this routine arrangement would become anything but ordinary. Morning brought brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow. The ranch transformed overnight into a winter wonderland, with snow-laden pine branches creating natural archways along the paths between cabins. After breakfast, Andrew suggested we build an igloo for the kids. "I've never seen snow this perfect for packing," he said, demonstrating by forming a perfect snowball with minimal effort. We spent hours in childlike play, crafting a surprisingly sturdy snow structure while Emma and Ben squealed with delight. Yet throughout the day, I noticed Grandpa frequently scanning the tree line, his expression unreadable. Once, I caught him staring intently at something in the distance, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that always hung above the kitchen door when we visited. "Everything okay?" I asked. He blinked, as if returning from deep thought. "Just keeping an eye out. Had some trouble with predators lately. Probably just coyotes getting bold with the harsh winter." But something in his tone suggested he wasn't being entirely forthcoming. I noticed he'd been talking in hushed tones with my father and Andrew, conversations that abruptly shifted when anyone else approached. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered again, promising more snow. The temperature dropped noticeably, and we retreated indoors for hot chocolate and board games. I observed subtle changes in the adults' behavior, the way they tensed at unexpected sounds, how they checked door locks twice, the flashlights and radios placed strategically near entrances. "What's really going on?" I finally asked my mother as she prepared sandwich plates for dinner. She hesitated, knife suspended above the bread. "Nothing you need to worry about. Just stay close to the cabins after dark, okay?" Nell suggested we continue our marathon of board games after dinner, but I declined, feeling unusually fatigued from the day's activities and the altitude. "I think I'll head back to the cabin early," I said, suppressing a yawn. "I need to finish the book I started." "I'll come with you," Nell offered, but Grandma interrupted. "Actually, Nell, Would you mind helping me organize some photo albums? I've been meaning to sort through them, and your eye for detail would be appreciated. The request seemed oddly timed, but Nell agreed. I'll join you later then, she told me. Don't fall asleep with the light on like last time. As I prepared to leave, Grandpa handed me a powerful flashlight. Stay on the path, he instructed firmly, and lock the door behind you. The intensity in his eyes made me pause. Is there something I should know? He squeezed my shoulder. Just being cautious. The mountains demand respect, especially in winter. The path to Pine Cabin was well marked with solar lights, but darkness had descended completely, rendering them little more than dim beacons in a sea of black. The moon remained hidden behind thick clouds, and the snowfall had resumed, gentler now, but persistent. My flashlight carved a narrow tunnel of visibility through the darkness. Beyond its beam, the forest was an impenetrable wall of shadow. Every few steps I would swing the light in a wide arc, illuminating sections of woods that immediately returned to darkness once the beam passed. The temperature had plummeted further, creating that peculiar silence unique to extreme cold. A silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound rather than merely lack it. My boots crunched rhythmically in the fresh powder, the noise unnaturally loud against the backdrop of nothing. Halfway to the cabin I stopped. Not consciously, not with any clear thought. My body simply ceased moving as if responding to some primal warning system buried deep in my evolutionary past. The hairs on my arms and neck rose simultaneously, and my breath caught in my throat. I was being watched. Slowly I turned in a complete circle, sweeping the flashlight beam across the surrounding forest. The light reflected off snow-covered branches and created strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Nothing concrete, nothing I could point to. Yet the feeling of observation intensified. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded small and vulnerable in the vast darkness. No response came, save for a distant cracking sound, perhaps a branch giving way under the weight of accumulated snow, perhaps something else entirely. I quickened my pace, no longer concerned with appearing afraid. Pine Cabin materialized from the darkness like a sanctuary, its windows glowing with the warm light I'd left on before dinner. I practically ran the final yards, fumbled with the key, and burst inside, slamming the door behind me and engaging both the deadbolt and the secondary chain lock. The cabin's interior offered immediate comfort: a queen-sized bed with a handmade quilt, a small bathroom, a writing desk beneath the window, and a comfortable reading chair. A skylight above the bed would normally offer stargazing opportunities, but tonight showed only darkness and occasional snowflakes. I tried to shake off my unease, attributing it to an overactive imagination fueled by the adult's mysterious behavior. After washing up and changing into warm pajamas, I settled onto the bed with my Kindle, determined to lose myself in a novel rather than dwell on formless fears. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 9:37 p.m. Nell would likely arrive within the hour, and I looked forward to her company. Until then, I immersed myself in my book, gradually relaxing as the fictional world pulled me away from my surroundings. Until the sound. At first, I wasn't sure I'd heard anything at all, perhaps just the wind or snow sliding from the roof. But then it came again. A low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, but something deeper, more deliberate. It emanated from directly behind me, from the other side of the window above the headboard. My entire body tensed. The sound came again, louder this time, impossible to dismiss as anything natural or familiar. With trembling hands, I set my Kindle aside and slowly turned toward the window. What I saw will forever be etched in my memory. Pressed against the glass was a face, or something approximating a face. In the dim light, I could make out features that resembled a wolf. Elongated snout, pointed ears, glinting eyes that reflected an unnatural yellow in the cabin light. But the proportions were wrong. the size impossibly large for any canine native to these mountains. I remained frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. The creature's breath fogged the glass in rhythmic pulses, creating and dispelling small circles of condensation. We stared at each other for what felt like eternity, though it could only have been seconds. Then it moved. A limb rose into view. Not a paw, but something horrifyingly in between animal and human. Fingers too long, joints too numerous, tipped with curved claws that looked capable of shredding metal. This impossible appendage pressed flat against the window, spreading wide as if measuring the barrier's strength. I scrambled backward off the bed, nearly falling in my haste. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The window this creature peered through was at least 7 feet off the ground on the outside, where the cabin was built into the sloping mountainside. For its face to be visible required it to stand upright at a height no natural animal could achieve. The claws began to drag downward, creating a sound so grating and deliberate it seemed designed to unnerve. The screech of keratin against glass sent waves of revulsion through my body. I watched, paralyzed, as it traced what appeared to be deliberate patterns. Not random scratches, but something with purpose. Then, abruptly, the face withdrew from the window. I heard heavy movement outside, something large circling the cabin with slow, measured steps. Occasional scrapes against the wooden exterior suggested it was testing the structure, searching for weakness. With horror, I realized I had left the front door unlocked for Nell. Adrenaline finally broke my paralysis. I lunged for the door, my stockinged feet sliding on the wooden floor. My hands fumbled with the deadbolt, finally engaging it with a solid click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. I added the chain lock as well, though it suddenly seemed flimsy protection against whatever circled outside. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, cursing as I saw the single bar of reception flickering uncertainly. Mountain service was always spotty, but the snowstorm made it worse. I dialed my mother's number with shaking fingers, praying the call would connect. Outside, something heavy impacted the side of the cabin. Not a casual brush, but a deliberate strike that made the entire structure shudder. The lights flickered momentarily, plunging the cabin into darkness before humming back to life. The call connected just as another blow struck the cabin, this one powerful enough to knock a framed landscape from the wall. It crashed to the floor, glass shattering. "Mom!" I screamed into the phone as soon as I heard her voice. "Something's trying to get in. There's something outside the cabin." Her response was immediate. "Stay away from the windows. We're coming." Another impact, this time against the door itself. The wood creaked ominously, and I could hear the deadbolt rattling in its housing. Whatever was out there understood doors, understood locks. This wasn't mindless animal behavior. "Hurry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if she could still hear me. The phone showed the call had dropped. I retreated to the bathroom, the only space without windows, clutching the flashlight Grandpa had given me like a talisman. Outside, the creature continued its methodical assault on the cabin, testing different entry points with frightening intelligence. The minutes stretched endlessly as I huddled against the bathtub, ears straining for any sound that might indicate help was coming. When the distant rumble of an engine finally penetrated the noise of the assault, the relief was so intense I nearly collapsed. The creature's reaction to the approaching vehicle was immediate. The assault on the cabin ceased, replaced by what sounded like rapid movement through the snow. I heard the growl of my grandfather's truck drawing closer, its headlights briefly illuminating the bathroom through the crack beneath the door. "Riley," my grandfather's voice called out, deep and authoritative. "Are you in there?" I burst from the bathroom, still clutching the flashlight. "I'm here. Don't come in without a weapon." Through the window beside the door, I could see my grandfather, father, and 2 uncles, Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter, all armed with hunting rifles. My grandfather carried his prized Remington 700, a serious weapon he used for elk hunting. They formed a protective semicircle, scanning the surroundings with practiced movements that spoke of military training from their younger days. "Unlock the door, Riley," my father called. "Quick now." I disengaged the locks with trembling hands and nearly fell into my father's arms as he entered. Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter remained outside, rifles raised, moving in slow circles as they surveyed the darkness beyond the cabin's immediate vicinity. "What happened?" Dad asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. The words tumbled out in a confused rush. The face at the window, the hand that wasn't a hand, the methodical testing of the cabin's defenses. As I spoke, Grandpa examined the window where I'd first seen the creature. "Look here," he said grimly, pointing his flashlight. In the beam, deep scratches were visible in the wooden frame surrounding the glass. Not random damage, but deliberate markings that almost resembled crude symbols. Uncle Peter called from outside. "Russell, you need to see this." We joined them, my father keeping a protective arm around my shoulders. Uncle Peter's flashlight illuminated the snow beneath the elevated side of the cabin, the side where I'd seen the creature at the window. Imprinted in the fresh powder were tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They resembled wolf prints in their general shape, but were massively oversized, each easily larger than my grandfather's outstretched hand. More disturbing were the inconsistencies in their formation, sometimes showing distinct toe pads like a canine, other times displaying what looked disturbingly like elongated finger marks. "What made these?" I whispered. The four men exchanged looks heavy with meaning. Grandpa's weathered face was grim in the harsh flashlight beam. "We need to get back to the main house," he said instead of answering. "Now." As we hurried along the path, Uncle Daniel and Uncle Peter positioned themselves at the front and rear of our group, rifles ready. My father and grandfather flanked me, their eyes constantly scanning the darkness between the trees. "There's something you should see," Grandpa said quietly as we walked. He directed his flashlight toward a massive pine about 20 feet off the path. Deep gouges marred its trunk, vertical scrapes that extended upward far beyond the reach of a standing man, at least 20 feet high. "Found these 3 days ago," he continued. "Similar marks on trees throughout the property. Game cameras keep getting destroyed before we can retrieve any footage." "What is it?" I asked, voice barely audible over the crunching snow beneath our boots. "Don't know for certain," Grandpa admitted. "But it's big, it's smart, and it's not natural to these mountains." The main house was ablaze with light when we arrived, every exterior lamp illuminated, casting harsh shadows across the snow-covered yard. Mom rushed out to meet us, wrapping me in a fierce embrace before ushering me inside where Grandma, Nell, Andrew, Joanna, and the children waited anxiously. Emma and Ben had been put to bed in the upstairs guest room, mercifully unaware of the tension permeating the house. The adults gathered in the kitchen, voices low but urgent. "I told you it was escalating," Grandpa said to my father. "This isn't random wildlife behavior." Uncle Peter placed his rifle on the kitchen table, a breach of Grandma's usual house rules that she didn't comment on. "We should call Fish and Wildlife again." "They didn't take us seriously last time," Uncle Daniel countered. "Suggested it was just a particularly large black bear, despite the evidence." "What exactly is happening here?" Nell demanded, her usual composure frayed. "What was out there?" Grandpa sighed heavily, exchanging glances with Grandma before addressing us all. "Something's been stalking the property for about 3 weeks now. Started with missing chickens, then one of the barn cats disappeared. Last week we found one of the yearling calves dead in the north pasture. Not killed for food, just torn apart." "And you didn't think to warn us before we came up here?" Mom's voice held a sharp edge. "We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily," Grandma interjected. "Russell thought it might move on once the weather improved. Predators get desperate during hard winters." "This isn't desperation," I said, all eyes turning to me. "Whatever I saw was intelligent." It was testing the cabin, looking for ways in. And those scratches on the window frame, they looked deliberate, like it was marking territory. A heavy silence followed my words. Grandpa nodded slowly. Riley's right. This isn't normal predator behavior. I've called the ranger station, Uncle Daniel announced, returning from the living room where he'd been on the landline. They're sending someone first thing tomorrow, but with the snow, it could be midday before they arrive. Grandpa loaded shells into his shotgun with practiced efficiency. We'll take watches through the night, 2-hour shifts, pairs at all times. Peter and I will take first watch. Daniel and Andrew second, then John and I will take the pre-dawn hours. No one argued with the arrangement. The women and I were tasked with checking all windows and doors, ensuring every possible entry point was secured. The ranch house was built with security in mind. Solid oak doors, reinforced frames, windows that could be barricaded if necessary. As we worked, I described in greater detail what I'd seen at the cabin. The more I spoke, the more I realized how difficult it was to accurately convey the wrongness of the creature, how it seemed to occupy an unsettling middle ground between wolf and human, between animal instinct and calculated intelligence. I've heard stories, Grandma said quietly as we checked the latches on the living room windows. Old tales from the indigenous people who lived in these mountains long before European settlers arrived. Stories about creatures that walk between forms, that hunt not just for sustenance but for sport. You think that's what's out there? I asked, skepticism warring with the vivid memory of what I'd seen. She shook her head. I think there are things in these mountains that defy easy explanation. Things that modern science hasn't cataloged. Whether it's an undiscovered species or something else entirely, I can't say. Sleep was impossible for most of us that night. I dozed fitfully on the living room sofa, jerking awake at every creak of the old house, every whispered conversation between the men as they changed watch shifts. Through the window, I could see them patrolling the perimeter of the house, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, rifles held ready. Sometime in the early morning hours, I was startled fully awake by urgent voices on the back porch. Uncle Peter and my father were speaking rapidly, their breath visible in the pre-dawn air as I peered through the window. Circled the entire property, Uncle Peter was saying. Multiple sets of tracks, all the same type. How many? Dad asked, his voice tight. Hard to be certain. At least 3 distinct individuals, based on the stride length and depth. I felt my stomach drop. Not one creature, but several. A pack. Dawn arrived with painful slowness, the sky transitioning from black to deep blue to a pale, washed-out gray that offered little comfort. The snowfall had stopped, but heavy clouds remained, promising more before the day's end. No one had encountered anything during the night watches, though Uncle Daniel reported hearing something large moving through the trees around 3 a.m. Nothing had approached the house directly. After a tense breakfast that no one had much appetite for, Grandpa, Uncle Peter, and my father prepared to visit Pine Cabin in daylight to retrieve our belongings and examine the damage more thoroughly. Andrew would remain at the main house with Uncle Daniel to protect the rest of the family. I want to come too, I insisted. I should see it in daylight. After some debate, they reluctantly agreed, provided I stayed close and followed instructions without question. We armed ourselves, the men with rifles, me with Grandpa's heavy maglite that could double as a club if necessary, and set out along the now familiar path. Daylight transformed the forest, rendering it ordinary, almost disappointingly benign after the terrors of the night. The tracks, however, told a different story. In the harsh clarity of morning, they were even more disturbing. Massive prints that followed our path from the main house to the cabin with unsettling precision, veering off occasionally to circle trees or investigate other cabins, but always returning to the main trail. Pine Cabin looked surprisingly intact from the outside, though deep gouges marred the wooden siding in several places. The most concentrated damage was around the windows and door, points of potential entry. Something tried very hard to get in, Uncle Peter observed, running his fingers along scratches in the door frame that had splintered the solid oak. Inside, I collected my belongings while the men examined the cabin methodically. Grandpa took photographs with a digital camera, documenting the damage for the authorities and insurance purposes. "Look at this pattern," Dad called from the window where I'd first seen the creature. He pointed to the scratches in the wooden frame, which upon closer inspection did indeed form a distinct pattern, 3 vertical lines intersected by 2 horizontal ones. "It's on the door frame too," Uncle Peter noted, "and here by the bathroom window." Grandpa's expression grew increasingly troubled as we found the same marking repeated throughout the cabin. "This isn't random damage." As we prepared to leave, a truck with Forest Service markings pulled up outside. 2 uniformed rangers emerged, a tall bearded man in his 50s, and a younger woman with sharp eyes that immediately began assessing the scene. "Russell," the older ranger greeted my grandfather with a firm handshake. "Wish we were meeting under better circumstances. I'm taking your reports a lot more seriously after what happened at the Nelson property." "Nelson property?" Grandpa's voice sharpened. "What happened?" The rangers exchanged glances. "You haven't heard? 3 nights ago, about 15 miles northeast of here. Family of 4. Their vacation cabin was broken into. Parents killed, children missing. Signs of large predator activity, but what?" my father pressed. "But inconsistent with known predator behavior," the female ranger finished. "Door was forced open, not clawed through. Food left untouched. And markings on the walls and door frames similar to what I'm seeing here." A cold weight settled in my stomach. The creatures I'd seen weren't just curious or territorial. They were actively hunting humans. While the adults continued their grim conversation, I wandered a short distance from the cabin, needing space to process this new information. The forest seemed to press in around me, no longer benign despite the daylight. A flash of color caught my eye. Something red against the pristine white snow about 20 yards from the cabin. Curious, I moved closer, discovering a torn piece of fabric snagged on a low branch. It looked like part of a child's winter coat, the material expensive and relatively new. "Grandpa," I called, holding up my discovery. "I found something." The rangers were particularly interested in the fabric, placing it carefully in an evidence bag. "This matches the description of what one of the Nelson children was wearing," the female ranger confirmed, her expression grim. Further search of the area revealed more disturbing findings. Additional tracks showing what appeared to be something large dragging a heavy object through the snow, small items of children's clothing, and most chillingly, a distinct trail leading deeper into the forest toward the most remote regions of the mountain range. "We need to organize a proper search party," the male ranger decided, already on his radio calling for backup. "If there's any chance those children are still alive." We returned to the main house in somber silence, the implications of our discoveries weighing heavily on everyone. The rangers' backup would arrive within hours, bringing additional personnel, tracking dogs, and more comprehensive equipment. Grandpa insisted we pack immediately and leave before noon. "This isn't our fight now," he said firmly. "The authorities are taking over, and I want my family safely off this mountain." No one argued. Even Grandma, who typically hated leaving her home, was already packing essentials into well-worn suitcases. We were ready to leave within the hour, vehicles packed and children secured in their car seats. The rangers had established a command post at the main house, additional Forest Service and Sheriff's Department vehicles arriving in a steady stream. Men and women in uniform moved with purposeful efficiency, unloading equipment and consulting topographical maps spread across Grandpa's kitchen table. As we prepared to depart, the female ranger approached me. "I'd like to get a formal statement from you," she said. "You're the only one who saw these creatures clearly." In the stark daylight of the kitchen, surrounded by law enforcement professionals, I felt suddenly self-conscious about my account. Would they believe me? Would they dismiss what I'd seen as the overactive imagination of a frightened teenager? But as I described the events of the previous night, the face at the window, the hand that wasn't quite a hand, the methodical testing of the cabin's defenses, I saw recognition in the ranger's eyes. "This matches other reports we've received," she confirmed when I finished. "Isolated incidents over the past decade, but increasing in frequency and boldness over the last 6 months." "What are they?" I asked, the question that had haunted me since the previous night. She hesitated. "Officially, unknown predator species, possibly wolves with genetic abnormalities or bears with unusual behavior patterns." Her voice lowered. "Unofficially, something that shouldn't exist. Something that's evolving, adapting, learning how to hunt us more effectively." A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the kitchen. "Will you find those children?" Her expression turned grim. "We'll try. But given what we know about these creatures' behavior patterns..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As we finally drove away from the ranch, I watched through the rear window as the collection of emergency vehicles grew smaller in the distance. The mountain itself seemed to loom over them, ancient and indifferent to human concerns. 3 weeks later, the official search for the Nelson children was called off. The official report cited animal predation as the cause of the parents' deaths. The children were presumed dead, though their bodies were never recovered. Grandpa and Grandma sold the ranch that spring, moving to a retirement community in Phoenix. None of us ever returned to the mountains. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I still wake suddenly with the certainty that something is watching me through my bedroom window. I lie perfectly still, holding my breath, waiting for the sound of claws against glass. The mountains keep their secrets well. But sometimes those secrets venture down into the world of humans, hungry for more than just flesh. They hunger for our fear, our confusion, our desperate need to categorize and understand. Some things defy understanding. Some predators have learned that humans are easy prey when isolated, when comfortable in their perceived safety. Be cautious when you venture into remote places. Pay attention to the warnings your body gives you. That primal fear response that preceded civilization. That tension along your spine that tells you you're being hunted. And if you ever find yourself alone in a cabin in the wilderness and feel eyes upon you from the darkness beyond your windows, do not assume the barrier between you and what watches is sufficient protection. Lock your doors, stay vigilant, and remember that we have never been the apex predator we believe ourselves to be. God help you if you ever see what I saw that night. The memory alone is enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world and our place within it. Some watchers should remain unseen. "3 years ago, when I was 22, I made what would become the most haunting decision of my life. My close friend Maya had convinced me to join her as a counselor at Cedar Point Summer Camp, located on a remote island 12 miles off the Maine coast. The pay was decent, and the idea of spending July surrounded by pine trees and ocean air seemed like the perfect escape from my suffocating office job. The ferry ride to the island took nearly 2 hours, cutting through choppy gray waters that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. As we approached the dock, I noticed how the thick fog clung to the island's shoreline, obscuring much of the landscape beyond the weathered wooden pier. The other counselors chatted excitedly, but something about the place made my stomach twist with an inexplicable dread. Maya squeezed my shoulder as we disembarked, her blonde hair whipping in the salty wind. "This is going to be amazing," she whispered, but I caught the slight tremor in her voice. Even she seemed affected by the island's oppressive atmosphere. The camp director, a stern woman named Ms. Rodriguez, gathered us in the main lodge, a drafty building that creaked ominously with every gust of wind. The walls were lined with faded photographs of previous camp sessions, their subjects staring out with hollow eyes that seemed to follow our movements. As she assigned cabin placements, I felt my heart sink when she announced that Maya and I would be staying in cabin 14, the furthest accommodation from the main camp. "It's about a quarter-mile hike through the woods," Ms. Rodriguez explained, her weathered face betraying no emotion. "The isolation will help you focus on your duties without distractions." She handed us a hand-drawn map, the paper yellowed with age and marked with warnings about staying on the designated path after dark. Our trek to the cabin was unsettling from the start. The gravel path crunched beneath our feet, each step echoing unnaturally in the dense forest surrounding us. Towering pines blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight, casting everything in perpetual twilight. The air grew noticeably colder as we walked deeper into the woods, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was watching us from between the trees. The cabin itself was a small, rustic structure with peeling paint and windows that looked like hollow eyes in the gathering dusk. Inside, the floorboards groaned under our weight, and the air smelled of mildew and something else, something organic and rotting that I couldn't identify. Maya tried to lighten the mood by unpacking her cheerful decorations, but they looked grotesquely out of place in the cabin's gloomy interior. As night fell, the sounds began. What started as normal forest noises, rustling leaves, distant owl calls, gradually became something more disturbing. There were snapping branches that seemed too deliberate to be caused by small animals, and a rhythmic tapping against the cabin's exterior that had no natural explanation. When I mentioned it to Maya, she laughed nervously and suggested it was just the wind, but I saw her eyes dart toward the windows with the same fear that was building in my chest. Unable to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with our surroundings, I found myself drawn to the large window facing north. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a substantial hill that rose above the forest canopy. During our arrival briefing, Ms. Rodriguez had mentioned it in passing, warning us that it was off-limits to both counselors and campers due to unstable terrain. But something about her delivery had seemed rehearsed, as if she were hiding the real reason. "Maya," I called softly, not wanting to fully voice my growing unease. "Do you want to take a walk? I can't seem to settle in, and the fresh air might help." She looked up from her unpacking, her face pale in the cabin's dim lighting. "Where would we go? It's already past 10, and they specifically told us to stay near the cabin after dark." The reasonable part of my mind knew she was right, but a stronger compulsion was pulling me toward that distant hill. It was as if something was calling to me from up there, though I couldn't explain what or why. "Just a quick hike. We'll stay on the path and be back within an hour. I promise." Maya's hesitation was evident, but she'd always been unable to resist my more adventurous impulses. After a few more minutes of my persuasion, she reluctantly agreed, and we quietly gathered our flashlights and jackets. The cabin door's hinges screamed in protest as we opened it, the sound cutting through the night air like a warning we chose to ignore. The path toward the hill branched off from the main trail about 50 yards from our cabin. This secondary route was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and low-hanging branches that caught at our clothing like grasping fingers. Our flashlight beams seemed pathetically weak against the absolute darkness surrounding us, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on our peripheral vision. As we walked, the forest around us became increasingly silent. The normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife gradually faded until we were walking through an unnatural quiet that made every footstep sound like a gunshot. The air grew thick and humid, carrying strange scents that reminded me of ozone before a thunderstorm mixed with something metallic and bitter. "Maybe we should turn back," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silence. "This doesn't feel right." But I was already committed to reaching that hill. driven by a compulsion I couldn't understand or resist. "We're almost there," I replied, though truthfully, I had no idea how much farther we had to go. The darkness ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, swallowing our flashlight beams as if they were being absorbed by something hungry and waiting. The hill's summit was larger than it had appeared from the cabin, a circular clearing perhaps 50 feet across with an unobstructed view of the night sky. As we crested the final ridge, both Maya and I stopped abruptly, overwhelmed by the sensation that we had entered a space that was somehow different from the rest of the world. The silence here was absolute. No insects, no wind through the trees, not even the distant sound of waves against the island's shores. It was as if we had stepped into a vacuum where normal laws of nature no longer applied. The grass beneath our feet felt wrong, too soft and yielding, almost spongy. And when I aimed my flashlight downward, I noticed it had an odd bluish tint that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. Maya grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket with desperate strength. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her breath forming visible clouds despite the warm summer night. I knew exactly what she meant. There was a pressure in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on us from above while simultaneously pulling at something deep in our chests. My ears began to ring with a high-pitched tone that grew steadily louder, and I felt a strange tingling sensation crawling across my skin like thousands of invisible insects. That's when we saw it. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a distant star, a faint point of light hovering motionless above the horizon. But as we watched, transfixed by a terror we couldn't name, it began to grow larger and brighter. What had seemed like a single light resolved into 3 distinct red points, arranged in a perfect triangle, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to match the sudden racing of my heartbeat. The object moved with impossible smoothness, gliding through the air without any visible means of propulsion or any sound that would indicate conventional aircraft. As it drew closer, I could make out its shape more clearly, a dark metallic mass that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness, making it difficult to determine its exact size or configuration. Maya's breathing became rapid and shallow beside me, and I realized that my own lungs felt constricted, as if the air around us had become too thin to properly sustain life. The ringing in my ears intensified until it became a piercing whine that made thinking clearly almost impossible. The craft, for lack of a better word, continued its approach until it was perhaps 200 feet above us, close enough that I could see details on its surface. The metal appeared to ripple like liquid, shifting and changing in ways that hurt to look at directly. Strange protrusions extended and retracted from its hull in seemingly random patterns, and occasionally, brief flashes of light would travel across its surface like electrical discharges. Then, without warning, all 3 red lights suddenly intensified, bathing the entire hilltop in a crimson glow that made everything look like a scene from hell. The light penetrated through my closed eyelids, and even when I tried to shield my face with my hands, it seemed to burn directly into my brain. Maya screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut through even the deafening whine filling the air. The sound of her terror broke whatever spell had held me frozen, and suddenly we were both running, crashing through the underbrush toward the path back to our cabin. We ran without stopping until we reached the cabin, our lungs burning and our hearts hammering against our ribs. Maya's hands shook so violently that she couldn't work the door handle, and I had to push her aside to get us inside. Once the door was closed and locked behind us, we both collapsed onto the nearest bed, gasping for air and trying to process what we had just experienced. The next several hours passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Maya sat huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly back and forth. Occasionally she would start to say something about what we had seen, but the words would die in her throat, as if her mind was refusing to acknowledge the reality of our encounter. I tried to rationalize what had happened, running through every possible explanation I could think of. Military aircraft, weather balloons, some kind of experimental technology. But none of these possibilities could account for the craft's impossible movements or the strange effects it had produced in the environment around us. As dawn approached, I noticed that neither of us had been able to achieve anything resembling real rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 3 red lights burning behind my eyelids, and the memory of that metallic whining sound would return with such clarity that I would jolt awake, convinced that the craft had returned. Maya finally spoke as the first pale light of sunrise began filtering through the cabin's grimy windows. "We can't tell anyone about this," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. "They'll think we're insane." But even as we made this pact of silence, I knew that keeping quiet would be impossible. The experience had changed something fundamental about how I perceived the world around us. Every shadow seemed deeper, every unexpected sound carried sinister implications, and the very air itself felt charged with invisible threats. During the following day's activities with the campers, I found it nearly impossible to concentrate on my responsibilities. The children's laughter sounded hollow and distant, and I caught myself constantly scanning the sky, searching for any sign of the craft's return. Maya exhibited similar behavior, jumping at sudden noises and showing an uncharacteristic irritability with the kids under our care. The other counselors began to notice our strange behavior by the afternoon. During lunch, one of them commented on how tired we both looked, and another asked if we were feeling ill. Each innocent question felt like an accusation, as if they somehow knew about our nocturnal adventure and were testing us to see if we would confess. That evening, as we returned to our isolated cabin, the forest seemed even more threatening than before. Shadows appeared to move independently of their sources, and the normal sounds of wildlife were replaced by an oppressive silence that made every step sound unnaturally loud. The path back to our cabin felt longer than usual, as if the distance was somehow stretching with each footfall. Inside the cabin, we tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken terror. Maya prepared a simple dinner, but neither of us could manage more than a few bites. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, and every swallow was an effort that left me feeling nauseous. As darkness fell, the sounds began again. The same deliberate snapping of branches and rhythmic tapping against the cabin's exterior that we had heard the night before. But now these sounds carried a different weight, a sense of deliberate intelligence that made them far more terrifying than random forest noises. Despite every rational thought screaming against it, I found myself once again drawn to the window facing the hill. The compulsion was stronger than the previous night, an almost physical pull that made it difficult to focus on anything else. Maya noticed my distraction and begged me not to even consider returning to that cursed hilltop, but the urge was becoming impossible to resist. "There's something wrong with me," I confessed to her around midnight, my hands pressed against the window glass as I stared into the darkness. "I can't stop thinking about going back up there. It's like something is calling to me." Maya's face reflected the same internal struggle. Despite her obvious terror, I could see in her eyes that she was experiencing the same irresistible pull. "Maybe if we go back, we'll realize it was just our imagination," she said, though her voice carried no conviction. "Maybe in daylight or with better equipment, we'll see that it was something perfectly normal." But we both knew we weren't going to wait for daylight. The compulsion was too strong, and the not knowing was almost worse than the fear itself. By 1 a.m., we had once again gathered our flashlights and were making our way through the forest toward the hill. This time the journey felt different. The path seemed to have changed somehow, with new obstacles and turns that I didn't remember from the previous night. Branches caught at our clothing with what felt like deliberate intent, and more than once, I could have sworn I heard footsteps following us through the underbrush, footsteps that stopped whenever we paused to listen. The forest around us felt alive with malevolent intelligence. Trees appeared to lean inward over the path, creating tunnels of darkness that our flashlights could barely penetrate. The air grew progressively colder as we climbed, and by the time we neared the summit, our breath was forming thick clouds that hung motionless in the still air. Maya stopped suddenly about 20 feet from the clearing's edge, her entire body rigid with terror. "It's already here," she whispered, pointing toward the hilltop with a shaking hand. Even before we reached the summit, I could see the glow. The same crimson light from the night before was painting the trees around the clearing, pulsing with that same hypnotic rhythm. But this time, there was something different about the quality of the light. It seemed more intense, more focused, as if whatever was producing it had grown stronger or more interested in our presence. As we crept to the edge of the clearing, trying to remain hidden among the trees, I felt my legs grow weak with terror. The craft was there, just as we had seen it before, but now it was much closer to the ground, perhaps only 50 feet above the hilltop. Its surface rippled and shifted in the red light, and I could hear a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath our feet. But what made this encounter infinitely more terrifying was the realization that the craft was waiting for us. Its position, its timing, even the quality of its light. Everything suggested that our return had been anticipated, perhaps even orchestrated. As we watched from the tree line, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and fascination, the craft began to descend further. The humming sound grew louder, becoming a deep throbbing that I could feel in my bones. The red lights arranged in their triangular pattern began to pulse more rapidly, and new lights appeared along the craft's edges. Smaller, white pinpricks that moved in complex patterns across its surface. Maya grabbed my arm so tightly that her fingernails drew blood through my jacket. "We need to leave," she hissed. But even as she spoke, I could see that she was as transfixed as I was. Something about the craft's presence made it impossible to look away, as if it was exerting some kind of magnetic pull on our consciousness. The air around us began to change. The temperature dropped even further, and I noticed that the grass at the clearing's edge was beginning to frost over despite the warm summer night. My skin started to tingle with what felt like static electricity, and the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. Then the craft settled into a perfect hover just 30 feet above the center of the clearing, close enough that I could make out intricate details on its hull. The surface wasn't uniformly metallic as I had first thought. Instead, it appeared to be covered with thousands of small hexagonal panels that shifted color and transparency in waves. Occasionally, one of these panels would become completely transparent, offering glimpses of a complex interior filled with pulsing lights and incomprehensible machinery. A new sound joined the humming, a series of high-pitched tones that seemed to form a pattern, almost like a musical phrase repeated over and over. The tones were beautiful in a way that made them even more terrifying, and I found myself unconsciously swaying to their rhythm. Maya's breathing had become so rapid that I was worried she might hyperventilate. "Can you feel that?" she gasped, one hand pressed to her chest. "It's like something is pressing down on my lungs." I knew exactly what she meant. The air itself felt heavy and thick, as if we were breathing liquid instead of gas. Each breath required conscious effort, and I could taste something metallic and bitter with every inhalation. Suddenly, without any warning, one of the craft's panels slid open with a sound like tearing silk. A beam of intensely bright white light shot out from the opening, sweeping across the clearing in slow, deliberate arcs. We pressed ourselves against the trees, praying that the shadows would conceal us, but the light seemed to penetrate everything it touched. When the beam passed over us, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. My vision exploded into white-hot pain, and for several seconds, I was completely blind. But worse than the physical discomfort was the sensation that something was examining me, looking through me, cataloging every thought and memory with cold, alien intelligence. The beam moved on, but its effects lingered. My head throbbed with a migraine that felt like ice picks being driven through my skull, and I could taste blood in my mouth where I had bitten my tongue. Maya was in worse condition. She had collapsed to her knees and was vomiting violently into the undergrowth. As we struggled to recover from the beam's effects, the craft began to rise again, slowly ascending until it reached its previous altitude. The musical tones faded, replaced once again by the deep humming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But just before the craft disappeared entirely, something fell from its hull. A small, dark object that tumbled through the air before landing with a soft thud in the center of the clearing. Neither Maya nor I was willing to investigate what had fallen from the craft that night. We fled back to our cabin in a state of near panic, stumbling through the forest like wounded animals. The journey that had taken us nearly an hour to complete carefully now passed in a blur of terror-driven adrenaline, and we didn't stop running until we were safely inside with the door locked behind us. The rest of the night passed without any attempt at rest. We sat together on one of the narrow beds, our backs against the wall, watching the windows for any sign of the craft's return. Maya had developed a persistent tremor that shook her entire body, and I found that I couldn't stop my teeth from chattering despite the cabin's stuffy warmth. As dawn broke, I made a decision that I knew Maya would oppose. "I'm going back to the clearing," I announced, reaching for my jacket. "Whatever fell from that thing, I need to see it." "Are you insane?" Maya's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "What if it's still there? What if they're waiting for us to come back?" But I had passed beyond rational fear into a state of desperate need for proof. The encounters of the past 2 nights had been so far outside normal human experience that part of my mind was already beginning to doubt their reality. I needed physical evidence, something tangible that would confirm we hadn't shared some kind of collective hallucination. Maya eventually agreed to accompany me, but only after I promised that we would leave immediately if we sensed any danger. The hike to the hilltop in daylight revealed details that had been hidden by darkness. Strange burn marks on tree trunks, patches of grass that had been flattened in perfect geometric patterns, and areas where the vegetation had withered and died despite the summer growing season. The clearing itself bore obvious signs of the craft's presence. The grass in the center was compressed into a perfect circle, and the earth beneath showed scorch marks that formed intricate, interlocking patterns. But most significantly, lying exactly where I had seen it fall, was a small metallic object about the size of a golf ball. As I approached it, Maya hung back at the clearing's edge, her face pale with terror. The object appeared to be made of the same rippling, liquid-like metal as the craft's hull, and it pulsed with a faint internal light that seemed to respond to my proximity. When I was within arm's reach, I could hear it emitting a barely audible humming sound, the same tone we had heard from the craft itself. I spent several minutes working up the courage to actually touch it. When I finally did, the sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The metal felt simultaneously hot and cold, solid and liquid, and holding it sent waves of mild electrical shocks up my arm. Most disturbing of all, the object seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, as if it was somehow synchronizing itself with my biological functions. We carefully wrapped the object in one of Maya's t-shirts and carried it back to the cabin, where we spent the morning examining it more closely. Under direct sunlight, new details became visible. Tiny symbols or writing etched into its surface that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The internal light grew brighter when exposed to electronic devices, pulsing more rapidly when near our cell phones or flashlights. By afternoon, we had decided that we needed to report our encounters to the authorities, regardless of how insane our story might sound. But when we turned on the small radio in our cabin to check for news, we discovered that we weren't alone in our experiences. The local news was filled with reports of similar sightings across the entire coastal region. Dozens of witnesses had come forward describing encounters with aircraft matching the exact specifications of what we had seen. The Coast Guard had received so many reports that they had issued an official statement acknowledging unusual aerial phenomena in the area. But most shocking of all were the reports of other objects being found. Apparently, whatever had visited the hilltop had left similar calling cards across multiple locations, and government investigators were already en route to collect and analyze the physical evidence. Armed with confirmation that our experiences were part of a larger phenomenon, Maya and I finally worked up the courage to approach Ms. Rodriguez with our story. We brought the metallic object with us, certain that physical evidence would convince her of the truth of our account. Her reaction was immediate and devastating. She listened to our description with growing skepticism, her expression shifting from professional concern to barely concealed irritation. When we produced the object, she examined it briefly before dismissing it as probably some kind of experimental weather monitoring device that had fallen from a research aircraft. "I've run this camp for 15 years, she said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Every summer, I get at least one pair of counselors who claim to have seen something unusual in the woods. It's always the same thing: isolation, stress, and overactive imaginations combining to create false memories of extraordinary events." She went on to explain that the island had a long history of unusual electromagnetic phenomena due to its unique geological composition, and that these natural effects often caused hallucinations and equipment malfunctions that could easily be mistaken for supernatural occurrences. No amount of argument could shake her certainty that we had experienced nothing more than stress-induced delusions. She confiscated the metallic object, claiming that it needed to be returned to whatever research institution had lost it, and warned us that any further discussion of alien encounters with the other staff or campers would result in our immediate dismissal. The other counselors' reactions were even worse. Word of our claims spread quickly through the camp's small community, and within hours, we had become objects of ridicule and suspicion. Some viewed us as attention-seeking troublemakers, while others seemed genuinely concerned about our mental health. The few who claimed to believe us did so with the kind of patronizing sympathy typically reserved for small children, afraid of monsters under their beds. The remaining weeks of our commitment stretched endlessly ahead of us. We couldn't leave without forfeiting our contracts and facing financial penalties we couldn't afford. So we were trapped on the island with people who viewed us as either liars or mentally unstable. The isolation became even more oppressive, and we found ourselves withdrawing from social interactions with the other staff members. But the worst part was the knowledge that something extraordinary and terrifying had occurred, and we were powerless to make anyone else acknowledge its reality. Every night, we watched the skies, waiting for the craft to return. Every strange sound in the forest made us freeze with remembered terror. The experience had fundamentally altered our perception of reality, but we were forced to live as if nothing had happened. Maya began experiencing nightmares that left her screaming in her sleep. I developed a persistent anxiety that made it difficult to eat or concentrate on simple tasks. We both lost significant weight during our remaining time at the camp, and by the end of July, we looked like refugees from some unimaginable disaster. The ferry ride back to the mainland felt like an escape from prison, but the relief was temporary. In the years since leaving Cedar Point, neither Maya nor I has been able to fully process what we experienced on that remote island. The memory of those red lights and that impossible craft continues to haunt our dreams and intrude into our waking thoughts. I still have nightmares about that humming sound and the sensation of being examined by alien intelligence. Maya moved across the country shortly after we returned, claiming she needed a fresh start. But I know she's still running from the memories of what we witnessed together. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I find myself standing at my window and scanning the sky for any sign of 3 red lights arranged in a perfect triangle. Part of me hopes never to see them again, but another part, a part I'm ashamed to acknowledge, waits for their return with a mixture of terror and desperate longing for validation. The object we found was never returned to us, and my attempts to locate it through official channels have been met with bureaucratic stonewalling and denial that any such evidence ever existed. The news reports that had seemed so promising at the time were quickly buried and forgotten, replaced by more conventional stories that didn't challenge people's comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality. 3 years later, I remain convinced that Maya and I witnessed something that defied conventional understanding of what is possible in our world. But I've learned to keep that conviction to myself, buried beneath layers of forced normalcy and careful silence. The truth, as they say, is out there, but sometimes the cost of seeking it is higher than anyone should have to pay. I will never return to Cedar Point, and I've made peace with the fact that I may never know the full truth about what we encountered on that distant hilltop. Some experiences are too large and too terrifying for the human mind to fully process, and perhaps ignorance truly is a form of mercy. But on clear nights, when the stars are bright and the world is still, I sometimes catch myself listening for that familiar humming sound, wondering if somewhere out there, beyond the comfortable boundaries of our small world, something is still watching and waiting with patient, inhuman intelligence. God help us all if they ever decide to make contact again.